Are there further amendments? Gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and that the gentlelady from Colorado
Mr. Chairman.
reserves a point of order. And I'd now like to recognize the gentleman to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And unfortunately, claims have been made about this legislation that it will not impact FDA's current mission. And I supported this bill the last time based on some of that information. Unfortunately, it just simply isn't true. While much of the bill's tobacco regulation at the FDA will be funded through user fees, there is a provision in the bill that allows FDA general funds to be diverted for tobacco regulation. That, to me, poses a lot of questions that we should answer before moving this bill along. At the time when the FDA is strapped for resources and failing in many of its core missions, this provision is simply unacceptable. Mr. Chairman, you have rightly criticized the FDA's poor track record on food safety. The most recent outbreak of salmonella, which sickened over 600 people and killed at least 8, was the latest tragic example of the FDA's failure to protect our nation's food supply. You and many members of this committee have correctly asserted that the FDA needs more resources to carry out its critical food safety mission. Last year, Mr. Chairman, you were quoted as saying, and I quote, "Food safety is one of the most neglected functions at the agency. The FDA is facing a funding shortfall for food safety of crisis proportions," which proves to me, Mr. Chairman, you are as wise as you are handsome. This amendment would ensure that the FDA has the resources to ramp up food safety inspections before it undertakes tobacco regulation. And I think if we're going to have a sense of priorities in this Congress, we need to make sure that the things that we know are jeopardizing the lives of folks who have no control over it get taken care of. This is certainly one of them. It would require the Secretary of HHS to certify that the FDA is able to inspect at least 10% of our nation's food supplies, a reasonable goal. Last year, the FDA inspected roughly 6,000 of the 189,000 food facilities under its jurisdiction. It's just about 3%. My amendment would ensure that the FDA increases food inspections to at least 10%, or about 19,000 facilities, before diverting any general funds to tobacco regulation. And I'm just going to go down the list of some of the recent ones over the last few years. And unfortunately, the list is growing. There was a virus for green salad, lettuce, and fruit. Salmonella for sprouts, green salad, tomatoes, and melons. E. coli for green salad. And most recently, we know the peanut butter incident that 600 sick, 8 dead. This is a crisis. I can talk to my kids about cigarettes. It's pretty hard to say the Surgeon General warns you ought not to eat peanut butter. I mean, this is critical to the nation's food supply, and I would strongly urge, knowing how important it is that we get people to stop smoking, it is that much more important that our food supply is safe. I would encourage the adoption of this amendment. I think it's reasonable. It's something that we can support. And it doesn't say no to your bill, Mr. Chairman. It just says we have priorities that we must meet that impact every single household in this country. And I would yield back the remainder of my time.
Chairman, I withdraw my reservation.
Gentlelady withdraws her reservation. Gentleman yields back his time. The chair recognizes himself in opposition to the amendment. This bill provides for a user fee to provide funding for the FDA to do the job of regulating tobacco, and it does not take away money from the other FDA responsibilities, a major one of which is food safety. We're going to deal with food safety very soon and try to make sure that FDA has the resources. But that doesn't mean that FDA shouldn't be able to take on the job of regulating tobacco as under this bill. So I would urge opposition to the amendment. Are we ready for the vote on this?
30-second response, Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Mr. Terry, or either one of you. Do you want to yield your time?
Yeah, I will yield my time if you.
Okay, gentleman's recognized from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to yield time to Mr. Rogers, specifically to clarify which features are handsome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Terry. Mr. Chairman, I just want to refer to you at page 142. I'm going to quote from the bill. Until such date, other amounts are available to the Food and Drug Administration, excluding fees collected under this subsection, are authorized to be made available to pay for costs described. It says in your own bill that, in fact, money will be diverted from this bill when we pass this law. And I would strongly encourage, I'd be willing to work with the chairman to exclude that language, but obviously we haven't had much success in that cooperation. And I understand your intent. As I said, in the past I voted for it, but this bill clearly states that money from this bill will be diverted if this bill passes, and I yield back my time to Mr. Terry.
Mr. Stupak?
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I'll be brief. For the last 3 years, we've headed oversight investigations done to food safety inspections. The problem with the gentleman's amendment is a couple of things. Number one, is he talking about domestic food suppliers, or is he talking about foreign? We're really weak on foreign. Number three, every time we've given the FDA money, like 2007, extra $10 million, they used the money, it was for food safety, to use it for bonuses for their top political appointments. Third point, in the President's budget that was just submitted to Congress, there's $1 billion dedicated to food safety. So until we get an administration that's willing to put the money behind the effort that we do need in this country to inspect food facilities, I think the amendment is just trying to draw us off the attention here, which is tobacco. So I'm going to oppose this amendment. We should put more money into food safety, absolutely. Drug safety. The FDA needs a major overhaul. So you can throw all the money you want at it, but if you don't have proper leadership at the top, nothing's going to happen. This president has put forth $1 billion for food safety in his proposed budget. So I would ask that we reject this amendment.
The gentleman yields back his time. All those in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. The noes have it, and the amendment's not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like a roll call.
You want a roll call vote? Clerk will proceed with a roll call vote.
Mr. Waxman?
No.
Mr. Waxman, no. Mr. Dingell? Mr. Markey? Mr. Boucher? Mr. Boucher, no. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone, no. Mr. Gordon? Mr. Rush? Ms. Eshoo? Mr. Stupak? Mr. Stupak votes no. Mr. Engel? Mr. Engel, no. Mr. Green? Mr. Green, no. Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette, no. Mrs. Capps? Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle, no. Ms. Harmon? Ms. Harmon, no. Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Inslee? Mr. Inslee votes no. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Weiner? Mr. Weiner, no. Mr. Matheson? Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson? Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow, no. Mr. Hill? Mr. Hill, no. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui, no. Mrs. Christensen? Mrs. Christensen, no. Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor, no. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut? Mr. Murphy of Connecticut, no. Mr. Space? Mr. Space, no. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton? Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Braley? Mr. Braley, no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Barton? Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Hall? Mr. Upton? Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns? Mr. Deal? Mr. Deal, aye. Mr. Whitfield? Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shattuck? Mr. Shattuck, aye. Mr. Blunt? Mr. Boyer? Mr. Boyer votes aye. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Ms. Bono Mack. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, aye. Mrs. Myrick. Mrs. Myrick, aye. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Mr. Murphy, Pennsylvania, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, aye.
Other members wish to be recorded. Mr. Matheson.
Mr. Matheson votes no.
Mr. Dingle.
Mr. Dingle votes no.
Any other members wish to be recorded or change their vote? The clerk will report the vote. And while you're counting it, we will break to vote on the House floor, and then please come back after the last vote as promptly as possible, because we'd like to finish this bill today.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the nays were 30 and the ayes were 15, so it defeated.
15 ayes, 30 noes. The amendment's not agreed to. Committee will stand in recess until after the last vote.